happy to take questions. So I'll take my evidence as read, and the discussion today about Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono, I just wanted to draw attention to paragraphs 45 and 46 of my evidence about this, that the methodology allows Ngāi Tahuki Murihuku to assess the landscape as known to them, then consider what tools, methods and rules should be included into the PDP. So it just kind of shows the sequence of events. But by doing the sequence of events, it enables Ngāi Tahu to obtain, collate and package a broad spread of information that's culturally and socially relevant to them. And then the important step that hasn't necessarily been picked up today is to then analyse it within their cultural contexts and paradigms. And then the last step is to weave it into the relevant parts of the district plan. Now, there'll be some discussion, and just to clarify, I'm not a planner nor giving planning evidence. I'm talking about this from the point of view of the methodology and then the overarching policy thought. In my opinion, for Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono to be in the district plan, it does need the appropriate rules and policies to hold the method or the methodology and its findings. So the PDP has to have the ability to appropriately integrate and use what is coming through Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono, and then make the most of it in an appropriate fashion. It can't come through and be appropriated into a Western construct. So I think that's a bit of the challenge that this always has in a bicultural system. The other thing, other matters, I've got a few points here, but I think we'll probably discuss that as we go. Happy to take questions.
So just in the context then of the recommendations that come out of the assessment, and I guess from my European cultural background, how would you envisage things like views of the Hokanui Hills being protected through that approach?
Yeah, I'm probably, to help answer that question, going to take it slightly back one step so you can hopefully see how you get to the point of that, and also what you'd actually be considering. So, you know, we talk about partnership, and both parties need to gather information that's relevant to them and analyse it and apply it in ways that are meaningful. So you take this methodology, which allows for this, then the step you're specifically talking about, Commissioner, is the write-up of the assessment. Now, for various reasons, including inappropriate use, it was decided early on that there would be a public-facing report released, which you've seen an example of. In that, because of the way the methodology works, it then talks about, firstly, how do we understand that landscape? Secondly, what do we deem to be appropriate within that landscape? And those recommendations are based on what is deemed to be appropriate. They tend to be at the level of assisting a conversation to be had within certain parameters rather than thou shalt. But it's not to undermine the importance of those parameters. And of course, parameters tend to hold values and first principles and ways of seeing the world. So, to then answer the kind of detail of your question, depending on what it's said, and noting that I haven't necessarily seen one done for this, that has come to that conclusion or recommendation, it would be then considering what was appropriate and how do the tools work. Like, what tools will we employ, how would they work together, and yeah, let's see where that goes. But it's a step that hasn't necessarily existed formally existed prior to Apiti Honol, Tātou Honol being released. And we can, we can probably tease it out a wee bit more if wanted.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I can't read body language online, so stop me when appropriate. You'll see also in my evidence I make reference to this being an overdue methodology, and I make that in, I just point that out, that it was overdue methodology in paragraph 43 of my evidence. There was, before Apiti Honol, Tātou Honol, the questions and the problem definitions tend to be set by the regulatory authority, just as what this council's grappling with within its district plan. So your problem definition tends to be based on, the legislation and your understanding of the local articulation of what's needed in issues. So when you come to a problem predefined, Ngāi Tahu Ki-Muri Hiku were finding they had to respond to that answer or respond to that problem definition. The step that hadn't been taken or nor encouraged or formalised through a methodology was actually, what did Ngāi Tahu Ki-Muri Hiku as tangata whenua, mana whenua, see that landscape? How did they see it? What did they deem was appropriate and therefore shape the problem definition and the issues trying to be resolved? And that's where the recommendations come through. So you go from gathering your information, running it through your cultural context and lens, doing your analysis based on ira atua, ira tangata, then you come into we'll call it the district plan for the state. There's other regulatory and non-regulatory processes this information can be used in, but it helps understand how both parties see and understand problems, issues, and therefore how do we solve them collectively for mutual benefit.
Have you looked at the amended policy we've been invited to consider that's evolved in the last couple of days? And have you got any feedback on that then, particularly given the description you've just given us?
No, I haven't. I'd say that will be for Ms. Brennan to respond to. Just trying to keep my discussion very much in that methodology, policies, let's not use policy, kind of first principles space or fundamental space, to then look about how this regulatory mechanism or tool is looking to address that. So I'll probably stop on the edge of that. What I would encourage, however, or point to, and it's one that we have discussed when we were doing Apiti Honol, Tātou Honol, to some extent, this methodology finally gives a voice to rules and policies already within your plans. Ones that have sat semi-dormant because there wasn't necessarily a substantial method or approach to undertake the assessment or the analysis. So to some extent, and this is where I was encouraging the understanding, and I think Courtney drew it out earlier this morning, you know, that it's woven through the plan. That in some ways there's things that Apiti Hono Tātai Hono allows to actually finally be utilised. So whilst you've got new policy in there and you're looking to engage, there's also the additional part of there's some things that have been set dormant or underutilised that Apiti Hono Tātai Hono will be able to uplift.
I guess maybe for future speakers, the steps that you described to go through prior to the district plan, we've been invited to recognise the approach as part of the policy, and if we would do that, I would see value in actually articulating those steps a bit clearer by way of what I describe as a policy of process. So it's more a statement at this stage rather than a question to you, maybe for Amy to pick up later.
Okay, and just really want to recognise, and I know we've said it, you know, the importance of GORE being the first to take this approach and methodology into a regulatory tool, such as a district plan, is awesome. But it's one that we collectively are teasing out. And we knew this right from, there's been a lot of discussions before this point, so I guess that was another thing I really wanted to reiterate to the panel is there have been a lot of discussions within Ngāi Tahuku Mirihuku with trusted experts and advisors, with council staff to nut out what this could look like into the future and to acknowledge that there is some vernacular change and process change needed. There's also a huge work program to provide equity for this approach. So, you know, we are looking to employ every tool we've got to enable success.
What do you mean by there's a huge amount of work required to provide equity?
Yeah, so one of the things, and I bring this up in my evidence as well in paragraphs 53 and 55, and I also raised it in the landscapers in the Apiti Hono Tātai Hono report. And I'll give you this example because I feel like I'm picking on Boffin-Miskell, but I shouldn't. It was just that I know how old they are. So, you know, Boffin-Miskell, DSIR have been around for 50 plus years. So the data that have been gathered over those 50 plus years, let's not put a budget on it, but it would be a lot of money has been spent on research. That research is predominantly in a Western style for problems and research questions set within that paradigm. Apiti Hono Tātai Hono has been around since 2021. 3 years later, we're just starting to embed it. Hopefully that understands how young this modern process is and how important it is to invest in it. the knowledge or the approach that sits behind Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono is extremely old. And Jo, talked about that in her evidence. But as a modern methodology, it doesn't necessarily have equity in the data sets and tools available to it that something like our landscape assessment has, or a natural hazards assessment has. So that implies that there's work both in the data need, but there's also investment and work required and a mutual understanding of how it works. And I look at the example that Hokonui and the council have already done in working together to work together to enable Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono in the district plan.
Thank you.
Thank you for your evidence and your explanation. Look, forgive me, but I'm struggling to keep up with what you're trying to explain to me, because it seems, and look, I'll guess I'll use the flavour of what you're putting across from my European or Western perspective. It appears to be extremely vague. And if I can't see a description of Apiti Hono Tainai Hono, it's very difficult for me to understand where it might fit within this regulatory framework. I've no problem with the association that it's important to the Hokonui Runanga and therefore it's important to the district and the council. No problem with that at all. I mean, that's a given. But I guess what you're saying, or what I have to say in response is, it's not until we see something that might be worthy of a variation that I'm going to be able to, I guess, understand where you're coming from. I guess what I should add, I know the submission and the evidence is being in good faith, and I would say it's being received in good faith. And that's my comment.
Might there be some parallels, I guess, that our European values and understanding we find in books. The Runanga's values we find in oral history, not necessarily in books.
And manuscripts.
And in...
And manuscripts as well.
Yeah, but I guess...
Look,
yep.
Sorry. I'll take you, and this is part of the reason for understanding heritage practice, to try and give everybody some basic tools or process diagram if you want. If you have a look at paragraph 14 of my evidence, it's a really simple rule of thumb, really simple rule of thumb for heritage practice. So you identify the heritage, record it, interpret, then assess. There's other processes that use, other disciplines that use a basic rule of thumb like that too. So I think this is something to come back to, and why I discussed heritage practice so much, is that whilst heritage or culture or worldviews, paradigms, when we're looking to draw them into the district plan so they converge, the point of convergence, I had hoped that my paragraph 14 would just kind of give a basic process step. And that is the same of what's happened in your historic heritage chapter. That's the same method used there. It's the same method used in Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono.
Thank you for explaining that, Elsa. I just have a query. How do you think not using this methodology has had negative results in the consent processing in the past? Do you have any examples that could be helpful?
Yeah, unfortunately I've got a national example. Māori heritage or Māori landscape values are the most at risk within New Zealand, and their record of destruction or inappropriate use and modification is on almost every metrics unacceptably high. They are the most at risk, and they are the most subject to misinterpretation. And so if you go back to that identify, record, interpret, assess, if you haven't done those steps properly, you can get a skewed response. So if you don't identify the heritage or the understanding of that landscape correctly within the cultural context, you're already off on a path way down here. So that's where it tends to go quite skewed quickly. And then by the time you've recorded it and interpreted it, you're already too far away to actually consider what's appropriate or not. So that's an example where it's been inappropriately used. And just to kind of draw on some of the other conversations and the evidence I saw, I guess to just pause that and then just kind of to get some context. The Gore district is in with the Ngāi Tahu Takiwā. Ngāi Tahu's relationships and traditions and cultures are across the entire district. There isn't a point where it doesn't exist. That's great. We can consider that. Done. Fast. Very easy. But so what? And this is what we're grappling with. And this is what Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono does. What's appropriate or not within that place. And to understand what's appropriate or not, you need to understand that place from the perspective of mana whenua, or Ngāi Tahu ki Marihuku for this, well, just for consistency of terms. Then you can work out what are you looking to protect, why, and for what, for whose benefit. So that's kind of how it steps down. So, Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono deliberately doesn't talk about a single reference point, nor does it talk about significance. Significance, as already has been discussed today, can be quite a skewed term. Basically, so that's where that sits. So Ngāi Tahu Takiwā, values, traditions, cultural heritage over the entire landscape. There isn't a point in which it doesn't exist. What the question is what's appropriate or not to do within that place. And that's where the recommendations come through.
I'm sorry. Can you tell me what is or isn't appropriate? You know, you posed the question that we should be asking as a planning group, what is or isn't appropriate so that we can accommodate it within the plan? So we need some distinction about it.
May I suggest, and I love this as a non-planner, just to stir up the planners, as I'm sure many in the room do. You're grappling with the equity issue, which was an important one to raise. And that you're also grappling with the issue that Ngāi Tahu Matauranga has not necessarily ever been collated for the purpose of what you want it to do in the district plans, didn't exist. So my suggestion is to consider how those data sets are built through this. So you can allow for the consideration of appropriate or inappropriate, just as I'm sure the lawyers will be able to discuss as is in the legislation. There, in my simple understanding, the plan needs to allow for a process in which Apiti Honol Tātai Honol is used to then consider what is appropriate or not. Now, just to pause there, I also always envisaged in my mind, again, not as a planner, but in my mind, that Apiti Honol Tātai Honol is your first tool. That it's your way of seeing this, so it's your proactive tool, where you would look to employ it just like had happened in Gore's example, to then go through and do some spatial planning and consider what zones should do what. I never envisaged Apiti Honol Tātai Honol to be on at a land parcel like 500 square metre level. It would be at that spatial, especially in, look, who knows what version 5 of this will look like in 10 plus years. But for the next 10 years, I definitely saw it as a proactive spatial approach.
Okay, look, thank you for your answer. I did glean something from that, and the part that I got from that is you're wanting the plan to allow for a process to develop and that cultural consideration to be considered. It may well be that I need some more input at some time in the future from the Runanga. Now, I can't do that as a sitting commissioner at the moment, but I think there will be sufficient time when this proposal comes forward to a variation, if indeed that's the route that it might take, to get some more information or more of a perspective from what the Runanga will be proposing. So look, I thank you for that answer. I know it was a difficult question, but I am sincerely trying to grapple with understanding the concept. Thank you.
So the words that I wrote down were not only that the plan must allow for a process of what's appropriate, but also your response that you didn't envisage it, the outcome being implemented at a 500 square metre level, more a proactive spatial approach. And I think that opens up a good process for me understanding where we're heading, but it's going to give rise to some further questions back to the planners and as we work through this. And I guess I'll flag that we're hoping to finish this all today. It may well be, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, it may be in the interests of all of us if we actually come back tomorrow morning as well. I just put that out there at this stage, or at some other time, because conceptually what you're asking us to do, and I've got a far better understanding from this morning, is that one is the understanding of what you're trying to achieve, and I'm getting there. I'm probably a little bit of a step ahead of Cliff, but then how that is actually implemented both in process and in terms of what we're doing in the plan, because whatever we put on the plan has still got to be within the framework of the legality of the European type approach that's in the RMA. So that's generated things for me to think about that I may not necessarily have thought through until I'm having a bit of a quiet time later.
I always love deferring questions to planners. It's a favourite pastime, but
Thanks for that.
I think
Appreciate it.
I think that just on that so understanding the scale and the proactiveness of this approach is that I would encourage that the plan also have the ability to hold in the right way the information and the assessment that Apiti Hono Tātai Hono provides, rather than appropriate or take control of. And I think this is the whole process, and for those who are involved in developing Apiti Hono Tātai Hono and the stage 1 of the landscape assessment study, is to acknowledge the authority of both partners. So Apiti Hono Tātai Hono, Ngāi Tahuki Murihiku led, it's their reasoning, it's their methodology, it's their why, and also their why bother. Where the district plan comes in is the how do we make this work, what are the tools and the legal mechanisms that we can do to make this work, in whichever way is deemed appropriate. So there is just that, I think too, where some confusion comes is if you walk into this conversation thinking it's the same as a Māori Sites of Significance conversation. So if you have to very much park that approach way down the road, maybe in another district, to be able to fully have an Apiti Hono Tātai Hono approach. They're not the same thing. They're not the same reasoning, they're not the same methodology. So just push Māori Sites of Significance out of mind
So,
for when considering this.
yeah, and that's extremely helpful, but the corollary to it is, where in the district plan should this discussion take place? Is it this mana
Question.
whenua chapter or elsewhere? Sorry?
I think
No, can't share.
it occurs in every chapter. It occurs in every chapter because you're talking about the way that land use and development has a impact or doesn't have an impact on all these different activities. So it's something that you consider in every single chapter.
Oh, okay. Go back a step. Where does the description of the approach sit? Not the implementation. And if mana whenua is about process, surely there should be something in the mana whenua chapter that deals with it.
Which there is.
Probably, given the questions that's come from here, it's probably not coming through clear enough.
Okay.
Any more questions?
I've
Maria?
always got questions. Yeah. So firstly, before I go into what I'd pre-prepared, I want to pick up a couple of things from your kōrero just then. You said that you wanted Apiti Hono Tātai Hono to be thought of as the first tool that then leads down a track, and you pointed to the fact that not the full district scale, but at that some of the work that has already been done using Apiti Hono Tātai Hono has played the role that you anticipated in the development of this plan that we're looking at now. And I can see you nodding. So that's a yes.
Yeah, it is. And again, just really want to recognise that this is an emerging approach. So every assessment we do, every lot of feedback, it gets sharper and sharper each time. But the fundamental principles stay the same.
Yeah.
So the nucleus of this methodology, and when we're talking about it, the nucleus is so old and so firm that its first principles have never changed. Nor can I envisage, in my personal opinion, a time where it could. What we do get sharper is at the assessment application, the output.
Yeah. So thinking about the outputs that we do have, So if you were listening, I'm really interested in us making best use of all of the available information that we have now. Do you have any thoughts on how we might interact with those 6 assessments that do have outputs and do have recommendations? How should we approach that in our decision making?
Just going to bring them up. Yeah. From my, and this won't be a complete answer by any means, but from my perspective, you've got a series of activities that are encouraged and both discouraged. And those that are encouraged in a certain way, noting the characteristics of the place they're talking about. So it's not necessarily a one size fits all, but you are talking about approaches to be encouraged or to be discouraged. I would hope that there are rules firstly allow for this to be given the weight it deserves and the recommendations made by decision makers or the recommendations made by staff, but also that the district plan allows for those proactive approaches.
And
which is really trying to stay out of the planning.
Yep. That's helpful and understood. Yep. So, also when you used the term first tool, I wanted to, and when you were pointing to the fact that you didn't imagine it sort of playing out at that smaller scale, that's a really important bit of korero you've given us, because where we've got provisions that are talking about Ngāi Tahu values or pointing to certain aspects of Ngāi Tahu values, Āpiti Honol Tātai Honol is then just one tool in the toolbox in relationship with other tools available in this district. How would you describe it within the landscape of other tools, and how those other tools might also apply if we're trying to use a provision that says, that is referring to Ngāi Tahu values? Where would you go?
Yeah, look, and when I mean first tool, I definitely mean the reason for that, and this is a bit of a backstory before I go forward, but is quite often how Ngāi Tahu values or Māori sites of significance have been determined in the past has been a piece of legislation that specifies this is to happen, and iwi are forced to use that tool. So by the time you get there, it's not even necessarily relevant to how you would see the world. So you're forced through a process that is only going to pick up part of, arguably only going to pick up part of what you want to talk about from a mana whenua perspective, and any assessments or testing I've done has proven this time and time again. What you're looking for is for Ngāi Tahu Kiumarihuku to arrive to the table with a proactive response, know what they're doing, and have had the confidence to do it within their own worldview. Come to the table, that is the first tool. Then you can start talking about your problem definition and go through to your spatial plan, right down to should it be deemed appropriate to put in maybe a smaller scale rule or a certain set of criteria across kind of a street. Who knows? I'm making this up as I go. But it's the tool which you employ first. And what that allows Ngāi Tahu Ki Murihiku to do is, here's the issue as defined by us. This is a matter to be solved through the RMA. This is a matter to be solved through the Conservation Act. This is a matter to be solved through the Wildlife Act. This is a matter on and on.
Mm-hmm.
But what that allows for, of course, is a uniform response. So that's what I mean by a burst tool. Comes in and lets you work out where you need to influence legislative or regulatory response, rather than the common model, which is currently employed, is that you've got the RMA and then the RMA is your only tool and you're just hitting against a wall. So you come in, Ngāi Tahu get to do the full suite using Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono, and then work out where they're going to and what levers they're going to push through the various pieces of regulatory and non-regulatory.
Yep. So I understand that's really helpful. And what relationship in working with the plan and the provisions that we've got control over at the moment, does the iwi management plan sit in relation to Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono and Te Kawa o Te Taio? So I asked this question, you might have heard me ask this question of Courtney Bennett earlier in the day, and so I'm just giving you an opportunity to come back with your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so from a slightly different, and they're not exclusive, or contrary, but when we do the Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono assessments, we use a suite of information, which includes things like the deed of settlement, the iwi management plans, Papatapu Runanga and iwi authority policies and plans, as well as a range of interviews, site assessments, existing data. The whole point of undertaking these assessments is to build repositories of information that are pulled together using Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono. So we do use them in our assessments, and then they help form, and you'll see when we do them, we'll talk about what's appropriate at that place and what the corresponding management recommendations are.
Mm-hmm.
And those corresponding recommendations, both what's appropriate at place and the corresponding recommendations, can actually almost be a direct line at times or bound within the iwi management plans. So because these approaches are all from the same worldview,
Mm-hmm.
they talk to each other.
Mm-hmm. This is really important for us because we know we've got partial information at the moment. We've got some very targeted assessments that have been done, and we've got to think about how they come through. And I think what I've heard there is that until such time as we have the full district assessment come through, however that looks, it might look similar to the breakdown that we've seen, or it might be, I don't know, we won't know until it comes through. But until that comes through, we can lean on the iwi management plan to help us with interpretation of
my.
Yeah.
And I think it's that, you're starting out, so it's using the tools available wisely, whilst also allowing for their growth and adaptation. The point that sits behind a lot of phrases that you see in district plans where they'll say, take into account iwi values or something like that, and it's almost a throwaway line. Well, that's paper thin, right? So we've never actually had a full analysis on that. And so what we're moving from is a paper-thin approach sitting behind these references and the rules to depth. And depth isn't necessarily one assessment once back in 2022. These environments evolve and change, so assessments will be needed or to be considered to build up a high resolution picture.
That made me think of building up soil structure or humus to bear fruit later. Anyway, that's by the by.
Imagine, for example, doing your natural hazards planning off one assessment done in 1970. You wouldn't. You'd be brave.
Helpful analogy. So, so what I'm going to do, given that we've had a really fulsome discussion, is I do have some questions that bounced off your evidence in chief. I'm going to go through them and probably weed out if we've already covered. One thing I thought might be helpful is at your paragraph 12, where you've referenced Article 31 of UNDRIP, and then you've listed some examples. I thought it might be helpful if you expand on what you mean about the relationship between that article and those listed examples. And I was particularly thinking about the iwi management plan and Te Kawa o Te Taio in that list.
Yeah. So also just on that one, I would also draw attention to the UNESCO definitions as well. So we're starting at that international point and then starting to go through. So for that kind of hierarchy, if you start at the international, what New Zealand signed up to, what we support, and you know that we were actually an author of UNIDRIP, even though we were one of the last signatories, that then has come through or is supported by those national directions, such as what Heritage New Zealand has been promoting or doing through its legislation, and come through, so ICMOS, its New Zealand Charter about protection of sites and places, monuments, and also their practices associated with. So what I'm trying to demonstrate there is that there's a consistency with Article 31, right from the international level, right through to what you're getting at a national level, through the decisions by the Waitangi Tribunal, right down to what the iwi management plans are encouraging and saying. I think that's sometimes we can just get really focused on heritage being a building and that it's a specific point of time. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that if you look up and down from Te Tangi all the way up to an international convention, they're supporting each other and they're consistent.
At your paragraph...
This is not a random conversation we've brought in.
No.
It's been one brewing for decades.
So it's whakapapa, really.
Yeah.
Okay. At your paragraph 18, I picked up that you've got a sentence in there. I'm just going to double check. Yes. You say complexity of Indigenous cultural heritage and relationships with Te Taio Te Aotearoa. When I read that, I saw section 6E at the end and maybe section 6F in relationship with 6E at the front. What I want to understand is, are relationships with Te Taio broader than cultural heritage as a concept? And have you differentiated them on purpose?
This is a great example of two different worldviews.
Yep.
So we've got the nature-culture divide that one worldview supports and is encouraged through New Zealand's legislation and approach to environment. And then you've got the Indigenous response of nature-culture are so interwoven, there is actually no divide. And to consider that there isn't. But it's also a bit of a nesting that one of people sitting that ira atua, ira tangata. So ira atua, looking at their environment, Te Taiao being the most senior, the one in which we exist within as the junior, the baby. So that's kind of a weighting. Cultural heritage is predominantly related to human experience and practice. It includes the spirituality and their connections, but it's, you know, the centre of a cultural heritage discussion tends to be a person. In really simple terms. So yes, it is a bit deliberate, ira atua, ira tangata. And also to say that Indigenous cultural heritage isn't purely the environment. It is also, yeah, I'm real pleased because I worked on this sentence a lot. It is also to look at that, you know, that 6F, that inappropriate or appropriate development on heritage includes cultural heritage, and things such as mahinga kai are cultural heritage, and this has been agreed to by UNESCO. A great example is on the intangible heritage list is falconry. Korean female divers, so the equivalent of mahinga kai, and from an appropriate development. And we don't tend to, in New Zealand, pick that up.
So if I had some little residual worry that if we come at it through the historic heritage lens, we are potentially being restrictive because unnecessarily, and you can understand why I'm asking that question because of the way Section 60 functions, because it does have that qualifier around appropriate, inappropriate, and Section 60 has no qualifier, which is why I'm wanting to know that we're appropriately capturing, like I'm understanding the points that you're making, and I'm trying to work out, I want to make sure that we're maintaining integrity and expression as we come into the RMA mechanism and work with it.
I think you're completely got the point that I was trying to convey, and that a heritage chapter or a heritage tool within a district plan does not have the breadth required to understand or provide for, even take into account, Ngāi Tahu ki Murihiku.
That's a weighty statement, and we're just going to stop there. And that's a similar point. So as now I go through my questions that I'd prepared in advance, it's possible you've answered most of them, so if you just bear with me as I scan through. Some of these questions I think are better dealt with in the SASM chapter as well, rather than going into detail today. This is just a small thing in terms of your paragraph 52. I just wanted to double check that what's in paragraph 52 is the quote. You sort of lead up to...
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you. That was last minute formatting. You're completely right. That 52 is actually meant to be a quote, and the quote comes from the report by Proctor and Harmsworth. I wish I could have even known what these words were, even though I do now know what they mean. But yes, no, that's definitely their writing.
Excellent. I did have the same thought with some of those words. Okay, I think I might ask this question, some of which belongs in SESM, but it's a way I've organised my thinking by the time I've got to the end of your evidence, so I'm going to test that. Is our job in relation to this plan utilising what's already been generated by Ngāi Tahuki Murihiku and is already visible, so that's not just Āpiti Honol, Tātai Honol, but whatever else is available to us? That one, we've got identification of Māori purpose zones, Māori reserves, settlement mechanisms referenced in the plan, and they do have a place-based specific, you know, geographical delineation. Two, that we are utilising the recommendations from those 6 assessments we do have in the framework of the plan provisions. And 3, that we're providing pathways for additional assessments to come through and be reflected in plan provisions, either as part of resource consenting or a further plan change process. So perhaps that last bit, were you imagining that it would be part of resource consenting processes in terms of Āpiti Honol, Tātai Honol assessments? But I'm thinking probably the answer is no. Is that, am I right?
There may be times where the resource consent is at a scale where it's deemed appropriate. So this is where scale is quite key. Getting a consent for a huge...
Wind farm?
I was trying to think of what's an appropriate one I can mention. Yes, let's say a huge wind farm is a bit different from someone putting a garage up.
And that's me. Thank you very kindly. You've been really helpful.
Happy to help.
Any more questions? Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you for accommodating my questions. I do appreciate it.
Me too.
And we'll now move on to the next submission from Ms. Beran. Thank you.
We've got one more, and then we'll go to Ms. Beran. We're almost there.
Okay.
But
I'm keen to get there.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think Dr. Murchison will be relatively quick, but just for completeness, I just called Dr. Murchison, who filed some Stream 2 evidence, and potentially could just go straight to questions. Linda, if you're happy with that.
Absolutely. I suspect, Mr. Chairperson and Commissioners, you've probably already read my evidence and have acted on my recommendation anyway, but I'm happy to answer any other questions there are in relation to that.
You summarised it well. We have read it and we acted on your recommendation to defer things, so no questions from me, thank you.
I have no questions, thank you. Any questions from the panel?
I actually think most of what, what you're covering and the thoughts that I had might be best directed to Ms. Beran. I had noticed one thing, and it might be interesting to hear. I saw when you were summarising in your paragraph 22, section 5, you were highlighting C, and then when I read Ms. Beeren's evidence, she was similarly selective but highlighted A and B. And I don't know that there's any particular reason why one of you went one direction and one picked up the other, but
I suspect that might come from the different topics that we were addressing. This was, of course, evidence for hearing stream 2, so we were right down into the nitty-gritty of the specific relief sought in those particular provisions, which of course was, focused around adverse effects, where of course Ms. Beeren's evidence is focused on hearing stream 3 and the order of plan submissions.
that makes great sense. Honestly, I think most of what's left here is best picked up with Ms. Beeren, but it was still useful to have your brief of evidence. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Behrens. Amy has a short summary.
Surely not. I was more tempted to adjourn. Okay, carry on.
A short summary, and we'll go from there.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So it's just a one page, so I'll be very fast. My name is Amy Beeren. I have prepared planning evidence regarding the submissions made by Hokanui Urunga on the proposed Gore District Plan. By way of clarification, I've not been involved in either drafting the Hokanui Urunga submissions or preparing the proposed district plan. My evidence covers the whole of plan submission points made by Hokanui Urunga, which have been allocated to hearing stream 3, as well as submission points on mana whenua and rural provisions that are consequential to the relief sought in the whole of plan submissions. My evidence also covers off several submissions relating to hearing stream 2 that was discussed with Ms. Bennett as part of our informal conferencing that we undertook before this hearing and after the circulation of the section 42A reports for hearing stream 3. The Hokanui Runanga submissions are generally supportive of the proposed plan as notified, including the mana whenua chapter. The section 42A reports for hearing stream 3 also generally align with the submissions made by Hokanui Runanga. The Hokanui Runanga submissions raised concerns about how mana whenua values are provided for and managed in the proposed plan, specifically that the plan as drafted does not specify the values and incorrectly includes references to sites of cultural significance. As such, the Hokanui submission seeks relief that would provide more clarity and specificity in the proposed plan provisions and allow for further work to be undertaken, which would be outside of the proposed plan process to enable potentially a future plan variation or change that would then better marry the Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono approach into the plan. So in my evidence, I support this approach. In particular, I support that the submissions seek to remove references to sites of cultural significance or wording to a similar effect to improve clarity in the plan, noting that there are no sites of cultural significance or SASM in the PDP, provide for opportunities to explore whether there needs to be a plan variation or a plan change to manage mana whenua values more appropriately and in accordance with the Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono approach, and wherever possible specify in the objectives and policies the relevant effects or values of concern to mana whenua instead of referring plan users to the mana whenua chapter, and particularly MW 2.3, and making consequential amendments to the rules to connect to the relevant objectives and policies that then specify what the effects or values are of concern to mana whenua, instead of solely relying on plan users having to refer back to the mana whenua chapter for guidance. I understand that the detailed drafting within other chapters in response to the last 2 points that I've just talked through will be considered in relevant Section 42A reports in the context of both the relevant chapter and the specific relief that is being sought. However, I note that these broader points have been considered at a principal level in the Section 42A report for the Mana Whenua chapter, and I understand that subsequent recommendations made in future S42A reports will be made using a similar logic to how the broader points have been considered by the reporting officer. So in light of the general support for the proposed plan, the amendments set out in my evidence are predominantly amendments to the provisions in the plan, and the only exception to this is the new policy which we've been talking about this morning, and that is to allow for a continuation of cultural assessment work across the district, and then to also explore potential options to develop tools as an outcome of that information that is gathered, which then could potentially come into the proposed district plan. And then, from that, there would be that confirmation as to whether there would need to be that plan change to enable those tools and that information to then come through into the plan. Some of my evidence seeks amendments that I think provide more explicit direction in the provisions rather than it being implied but not directly expressed. I think this assists in the implementation and use of the plan and avoids potentially unintended outcomes when the plan becomes operative. So noting that Waihi Tapu example, which I understand is now being resolved, but that was quite a good example of where there isn't guidance that those sorts of things could come up. So I hope that this summary is of assistance, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Is there anything arising from this morning's discussions and the questions that we've asked that you want to respond to as well, in terms of notes you've taken?
I think the biggest thing that's on my mind following this morning's discussions is this policy, and I guess what the best approach would be to going forward. I know there have been sort of discussions around whether it's something that needs to sit within the plan or whether it can be something that's sort of separate to the plan. But I think after listening to everything this morning and sort of reflecting back on my evidence, I think it does need to be in the plan. That's sort of where I've landed. And I think some of my reasoning for that, it really does come back to how do we best achieve the purpose of the RMA, and that's in terms of what is in the plan, so your objectives, and then how it flows through into your policies, your rules, and I think without having that policy there, then that potentially undermines how those provisions could be shaped. I guess I'm sort of taking a step back as well, because I know that there isn't that information there now to know what will come out of it. But I think it needs to be explored. So I think it does need to be in the plan.
So just focusing on that policy first then, in terms of what's in the memorandum. Part C, it says number 1, council will, and Part C, you use the Piti Hunu approach. Therefore, it is incorporating into the plan that it is the appropriate technique to use. Do you consider, from a professional planner's point of view, that there should be an objective and possibly policies that actually embed that?
So just to clarify, are you saying on top of this policy that there should be other provisions like objectives in the plan?
Yeah, so at present it jumps into the plan by way of a policy that says council will do things, and it will do them in the context of the approach that's there. Do you think the plan should go a step further and actually put in some objectives and potentially policies to actually embed that approach as the appropriate one to follow in terms of doing assessments of cultural values?
Yeah, I think it is something I would need to kind of think about how that could look, because that wasn't something that I had originally envisioned when I had suggested putting this policy in. So perhaps that's something that me and Courtney need to really discuss further to sort of understand what that could look like. But yeah.
And both in terms of what Elsa was describing as the different steps to be gone through prior to a variation of the plan, I think is the other dimension that's actually missing. And Courtney indicated that, hey, there is stuff in the Mana Whenua chapter in terms of the overall approach. But my comment was that I don't think it comes out clearly enough for the lay people, for planners who are processing or preparing consents to actually pick up on it. So I'm not saying that the panels will adopt that process, but if we were to adopt that process, I think there needs to be more of substance there that makes it clearer.
Yeah, and I would be keen to, I think, explore that more, because I do agree that at the moment, if you picked up the plan, you might not know that that's sort of, I suppose, the intent behind how values are incorporated into the plan. And I will be honest, like I said in my my summary, I've had no previous involvement in the drafting of this plan. So for someone who's come in outside of this process, it wasn't very clear that that's the way that values are being managed in the plan.
To repeat a question I put to Courtney, the provision in the plan said the values include the following. I'm just wondering what values need to be added to, or should that sentence come out altogether? So that's in section 2.3.
Yeah, I think that's hard to sort of preempt what the outcomes would be from that assessment work to then, I suppose, influence what those, if there were to be more values added into that section. That's kind of where it's hard, because you're sort of trying to preempt the outcomes of this further work that needs to happen. And I think, so as I understand it in the Mana Whenua chapter at the moment, those values are there more to provide guidance, and that guidance then helps go into those conversations that would be had with Papa Tapu Rūnanga. So it's like, for me, how I look at it is that a plan user isn't coming in cold, so when they do go to talk to Papa Tapu Rūnanga, they have an idea or a steer as to what the things they need to be thinking about.
So just thinking about that idea of objectives and or policies that might come in that we don't currently have, would one advantage of having a clear context and process objective, which National Planning Standards would tell us, stick it in the Mana Whenua chapter if you're going to do that, would one advantage be that if you had such an objective, at the point that you come back with a variation or a plan change, the plan has guidance about what it expects that to achieve? And at the moment, your draft policy is attaching itself to objectives in the SESM chapter. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. We haven't got to the SESM hearing yet to understand all of that and unpack it fully. But that was one thought that I've had, is potentially the advantage of having an objective to also help guide any future plan change processes, not just this one that we're talking about.
And I think in my evidence as well, I did mention how this policy can also back up some of the existing SASM objectives too. So that's sort of how it can link in there if it does sit there. But yeah, I think the more I'm sort of thinking about this potential objective to help, I suppose, guide that policy a bit better and what might come out of that, yeah, I can definitely see that there could be benefit in exploring that option, especially for plan users, so they have a better idea of sort of what direction it's all going in.
Thank you, Amy. Just talking about objectives in the plan, I'm interested in a landscape issue, which is the views of Mana Whenua around carbon forestry, and should the topic actually came up in hearing stream 1, and should there be a policy on that, and would it fit in with an overlay of the whole plan by Mana Whenua, because there are some concerns about carbon forestry.
I suppose it's a tough one for me to answer because I've been focusing solely on the whole of plan submission points. I mean, that's something I can definitely come back to if you would like that direction. I can go back and have a discussion with Hakanui Runanga to see if it's something that they would want to, I guess, explore further. But I've had no direction from Hakanui Runanga around that, so unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't really.
I guess from a planner's point of view, without impinging on the interest specifically of the Runanga, is carbon forestry an issue that could give rise to concerns from a iwi cultural perspective?
I think potentially it's really hard to sort of answer without.
Okay, there may be a legal response.
Yeah, and I sort of share Amy's thought that it wouldn't. I can't answer it for Hakanui Runanga, but I do know that landscape effects on cultural values and landscapes are matters of concern to Mana Whenua around the country. So in that sense, any impact carbon forestry would have on that, for example, might be relevant. I'm not sure if that helps or not. There's probably regional council matters outside the realm of this room that might be relevant to iwi in terms of forestry, I'm sure, but likewise I don't have specific instructions from Hakanui on that.
The forestry issues are coming up in the rural hearing tomorrow, and just trying to get a bit of context as to whether there's a cultural aspect that we should also be taking into account.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We'll check back, but it's probably as far as we can take that one. Sorry for you today. But, yeah.
Shane, if you could check back.
This question's not going to be any surprise given that you've been listening to the exchanges over the day, but yours is the evidence where the 6 existing assessments are brought into us. Has there been an examination of how those recommendations that have come out of those assessments been reflected in the provisions that we're working with? So that's question 1.
So a short answer is no, and the reason why is as I was drafting the evidence, we became aware of the assessments because we didn't actually know that that assessment work had been done. So there was sort of no mention. There's no mention in the district plan about those assessments. So we actually had to do a bit of digging to find it as a technical report that was sort of as part of appended to the district plan review work. So yeah, that's kind of why we haven't had that opportunity to actually consider how that work could then maybe be pulled through.
So we had advice from Ms Bennett that it may or may not be suitable to pick those recommendations up because the work was done for a specific purpose. What I'm wondering is, as part of this process, do we have an opportunity to explore first? Is it appropriate to lean into these assessments as we're looking at provisions relevant to the areas that have been assessed? And then, you know, what may need to be done or what could be done as a result?
Yeah, and I think that was something that we had considered when we did come across those assessments, was what happened with that work. So I think also based on discussions that I've had with Hukanui Runanga, sort of from their perspective, that was sort of initial work, but there's this continuation, there's this perceived continuation of work that needs to follow through. So that was sort of seen as potentially the start of the assessment work that would come through. And yeah, it wasn't, I suppose, clear why those assessments haven't sort of come through already.
So if we accept that there will be an evolution in depth of information, and that at the moment for our decision making purposes we're limited by what is currently visible, I want to make sure that we've properly explored the opportunity that we've got, because the evidence is in front of us, to understand how much Hokanui want to see picked up. When I look at those recommendations, and the one that we talked about this morning was that low impact design being targeted for specific areas in the district, you know, that's a very tangible recommendation that also relates to other submissions that we've had in this process, and so therefore would appear to fall within scope of submissions and might enable us to do something. I'm really interested in knowing that we have properly explored the opportunity that we've got right now. So I'll be guided by yourself and Ms Bennett as to, you know, what could be potentially achieved by when.
Just to clarify, was that just more of a comment or a question?
That I will be looking for guidance from yourself and from Ms Bennett as to what extent we can pick up that opportunity within the scope of submissions, with the corollary to the extent that Hokanui Runanga would like to see that happen.
So can I just clarify, do you mean for the SASM hearing? So when you say Ms Barron and Ms Courtney forming a view on that, do you mean
no
for that hearing, or
no
by when?
So that's actually why I'm asking. I think it's clearly an analysis that we don't have that would be beneficial for the process, and it isn't confined to one chapter of the plan. I think, you know, I've given the example of something I can see from hearing stream 1 that might be informed by such an assessment, and I imagine each of the chapters might have similar elements. I could see some elements that look like they might belong in the eco hearing, for instance. I just want to be sure that, because of, I mean, Ms Murchison's very clear in her evidence from hearing stream 2 about this interim and variation, and that's supported by Ms Barron's evidence with the draft policy. we're in the interim step, and at the interim step we should be doing as much as we can, because we don't know what the time frame is for any potential variation and how long our interim arrangements need to stand. So I think having an analysis, and the analysis might be really short if Hokanui say we don't want this further picked up, or we are satisfied that it's already been picked up in the way that Ms Bennett described. I just need to be sure that we are not losing an opportunity to be really targeted with use of assessments we already have.
Just a sort of procedural, mechanical comment or observation to think about. One option there might be a second conferencing session, essentially, and with some guidance as to what it's covering, but with a joint witness statement type output. And I can have a chat to my friend about that, but that might be then followed by a legal submission to give some context to that, perhaps, to sort of package up the output of that work stream.
One thing that I think it may help with actually is it will show very tangible outputs that provide concrete examples to take into when we do get to the SASM hearing. So the exchanges that Commissioner Bolger was having with Ms Kane around trying to grapple with what are the outputs of this thing, what do they look like, how do we use them. Here it seems to me that we've got some tangible stuff that we can demonstrate, maybe, depending on what the outcome is of those discussions, and that might be useful by the time we get to the SASM chapter as well.
So just in response, I'd be happy to have some further conferencing with Ms Bennett.
May I just raise a point? If you're going to do that, that all sounds fine. Can you include Ms Goose in that, because she's provided me an excellent explanation for where the Apiti Hono, Tātou Hono approach has been picked up and brought through in other chapters that she's been involved in preparing. So she has readily available on tap just where they've been utilised and encapsulated in provisions and policies. So that can certainly feed into that by way of explanation to the panel.
Is she in a position to give us an oral overview at this stage? I think would be helpful. Because one of the conversations I want to have at the end of this is where to from here. And I referred before, maybe tomorrow, but we need to think through the issues and probably issue a minute in some form to come back. And it may be the coming back happens during the significant areas hearing, so that we're dealing with everything together then.
Something to consider would be, so we've got, you're getting hearing reports, well, hearing reports have come out today for the next hearing stream, which will also include matters of discretion relating to cultural values, cultural values. And so it's a matter of timing. Like, we could spend time in the next hearing talking about the same thing, or in your minute you might want to signal that we'll park those issues and deal with them collectively rather than go through them in each hearing. So just something to think about.
So those 6 assessments that we've been discussing, we originally, they were provided and they've actually fed into the Section 32 reports for the industrial and the residential zones. This is because both the industrial and the residential areas, we have included some quite significant land areas for upzoning. 2 of those are actually development areas. And the assessments have been utilised in the preparation of those chapters in terms of that concept of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, and that's reflected in what activities are permitted versus managed versus avoided. And then there's also recommendations from those reports are weaved into the objects policies in relation to things like stormwater management in the industrial zones, around screening and that kind of amenity value, and then feed into the rules and the matters of discretion of when rules are breached. And those matters of discretion then feed back up to the objectives and policies. So whilst they may not be, the recommendations might not be there word for word, that's how we utilise those assessments in terms of managing the activities in those specific areas. So they have been referenced in the Section 32 reports and utilised in terms of drafting those chapters and those zones. I think we just might not have got to that point yet because we haven't got to the industrial and the residential zones.
So in terms of what we heard this morning, you've actually used them in a spatial way at that upper level, not at the smaller scale.
Absolutely, yes.
And do you envisage that that would be the pattern going forward? Because if it is, and you've used them as a tool for determining, I guess, the zoning of some of these areas, does it actually point to a variation might actually change the zoning of land?
That's quite a big question. In terms of what the evidence that we've heard today and the utilisation of those assessments, I definitely, from my understanding of it, those types of assessments, once done, that's not the end of it. There's a continuation on, there's reassessment, there's things changing, and I think in terms of how they could be, we've utilised them at that higher spatial level in terms of zoning. There probably is still space for them to be used again, for instance, for large-scale developments, per se wind farms, things like that. So whilst there's the smaller scale and then larger scale, in terms of the variation and whether or not that would lead to rezonings, I couldn't comment, not having the sort of, I guess, the work that's been done.
Or might
would
it
need to be done.
Or might it be trigger thresholds or things that sit in the provisions?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we've got an activity that requires a resource consent and there's a matter of discretion which refers to cultural values or back to the Mana Whenua chapter, depending on the scale of that activity, it might then lead to an additional Apiti Hana assessment.
If I can just add to that, so that's how the plan's set up, and that's why those hooks are in those matters of discretion. And what that does, it means the planner will have a conversation with the runanga about what scale of assessment might be needed, and it might be a phone call, or it might, at the other extreme, it might be a detailed Apiti Hana assessment, depending on the scale and the impact.
And what that leads on to is where is the objective and policy framework that points to that highlights that at a certain scale more is going to be required than just sitting down and having a look at a book. So I think that's the issue I want the planners to actually think through in terms of plan implementation.
Right, where does that take us to? Have we got any more questions for Ms. Behrens?
I'm just going to do the exercise of weeding and see what we've already covered and come back.
While Maria's going through that, I'd just like advice from the two lawyers present as to what you see as the most practical way of moving forward after today, please.
I can start while Mr. Garbutt's thinking. I'm reluctant to, I think there might be more benefit in having the planners go away and then us all reconvene again, perhaps, rather than reconvening tomorrow as sort of an initial feel, but I'm open to alternative directions. But I think that might make the reconvening exercise more productive, perhaps.
And if we went that way, then it would make sense for the panel to issue a minute first, the planners to go away, and whether we reconvene in the next couple of months or actually wait for the SASM hearing. I'd appreciate your feedback on that.
Yeah, I'm sort of open to either. The SESM hearing is quite a long way away, is my only thought there, and I feel we've got some collective momentum today that I wouldn't want to lose either. So I guess what I'm implying is that there might be benefit in reconvening before the SESM hearing, perhaps, but I appreciate that would need to fit in with the panel and council's other hearing streams and things.
I've got a question.
Before you go there, can we just finish with the...
Oh, very good.
Yeah, if I can respond, if you've finished, Josh. Yeah. The panel's asked the Runanga to provide some responses, which you're obviously entitled to expect. I do question the idea, it seems easy to throw to the planners to go away and do some stuff, but I was just checking. I don't think the planners have a different view on the provisions that they've put to you. So I was just asking, is it clear what Courtney would be conferencing on? But it's not, because they don't actually have a difference in view on the actual provisions. So you're wrestling with some tricky issues, but just throwing them away to come back with some more stuff, I'm not actually convinced is advancing matters, unless there's something that we've missed during the course of the day that you want to direct them to wordsmith. We've had a bit of discussion about the policy and the new one. I don't think, at least before you, the parties have any difference in view. I think you need to consider that and decide whether you're happy with that, or if not, you could suggest alternates for the views that people can provide. I don't see a need necessary for us all to reconvene to go over that, if that is the issue. So I'm just questioning that and wondering aloud whether there is advantage in the planners conferencing. So that's my view.
It might be two questions, because it's one, initially the conversation was around having the analysis of those 6 assessments that we do have, and while it was described as conferencing, I think it was more knowledge sharing and packaging and bringing back, which might be a different question to convening.
Yeah.
Two things.
Yeah, and that's fine, and that's why I raised with Ms Goose if she can be involved in that, because she has excellent knowledge about exactly where those have translated and land currently in the plan. And I know Ms Beran did explain to you that she wasn't involved in the drafting and had the view that they weren't incorporated in the plan, and that's obviously different from what you're hearing from Ms Goose. So yes, the planners could usefully provide you a bit of a roadmap about where those 6 assessments have been worked through in terms of the plan, so you have some degree of oversight in terms of have they been picked up, and if so, how, but that will land in other chapters of the plan, as you've heard. So you might be jumping the gun a bit to get the answer on that now when you haven't yet heard those chapters, because as we go through this exercise, you know, the 42A officers will explain to you, okay, this site has been zoned industrial, it's drawn on the Apiti Hono, Te Hono, you know, and you'll get that in due course. So you could ask for a bit of a roadmap now, and I'm sure the officers can provide you that, but I'd encourage you to keep it high level, because that's work that they're yet to do. Thank you.
That's very helpful, thank you. And the note that I made with Ms Goo's description that she gave us, that our reading material, which was just delivered this morning, needs to be looked at to get that understanding. So I guess it will mean something may happen later rather than sooner, but that's something that we need to talk talk through. I was interested in your views. But also, just to pick up on your other point, was that if we reach a view that the policy that's put forward by itself isn't adequate, you're almost inviting us to draft up something ourselves and put it back out to the planners to give some feedback. Did I pick that up correctly?
Yes, you're right about that, because the parties, with the support of their relevant planning experts, have provided you a draft policy that we're happy with. As I said to you this morning briefly, that actually lands in the SASM chapter, but we want you to consider it now because it's come up now. We're happy with that. If the panel deliberate and say, well, it's not quite doing it for us, we should know that. And you could either modify it yourself, but I would encourage you to send it back with some sort of instructions in an interim way that the parties can pick it up and then bring it back. You've obviously got final decision making on it, obviously. Or you could give direction in which areas you think it's could benefit from further work. That's absolutely fine. But I think we need a direction or some sort of feedback from the panel on that, because just putting it to the planners to go away without some direction, we're not going anywhere.
That's fine. There is, in my mind, and I'm sure in some of the other commissioners' minds, still that overlap that we've got between this chapter and SASM. And the objective and policy framework in that section, I guess one of the things we would need to explore is should part of it be in this chapter. And it may well be that we can't reach a view on that until we've actually had the other hearing. So while it may be a number of months off, one of the options that we need to talk about is what timing do we need to bring. And it may well be we say we would like to see something now because we're impatient. It may well be give some direction as to some issues we want dealt with as in the SASM report, or we may opt out and decide that we'll just sit back and wait. So I guess there are the three options before us. And
For Hokanui, I'm quite comfortable with, I agree with Mr. Garbutt's comments. The SASM evidence exchange does provide a relatively neat sort of opportunity to respond to a lot of this as well. But yeah, just to echo, if that could be guided by any sort of thoughts from the panel, I think that would be useful.
Personally, I think we're going to have to use your words, sacrifice that collective momentum until the next section. And it may well be that we come back with you with some specific direction or something specific to respond to.
I guess the last thing from here is there's the Piti Hono report that was done, and it's referenced in the evidence. Do we as commissioners need to have a look at that report?
I think it's the same question occurred to me as I was sitting here this afternoon, because I suddenly thought the initial report potentially hasn't been provided in evidence. The initial
What do you mean by initial?
Evidence makes reference to the report that was done. The report itself, prior to the...
So the original Apiti Hono, Tātai Hono report.
The methodology report, I think, maybe is
yes.
What we think.
Yes.
Okay.
From my understanding of the process, what is appendix to Ms. Bearon's report, that is the public-facing report, that is all the information available. For want of a better term, raw data.
Yeah, in your evidence you made reference in a footnote to a report.
That's probably the stage one cultural landscape study that Ms. Kane authored.
Right.
So that's completely different to this.
Yes, but you made reference to it in the report, and that's the genesis of
Yes.
where a lot of this has come from.
Yep.
So my question is, that landscape report,
Yes.
do we need to have regard to it and see it and actually receive a report that gives us a summary of it?
So that report is on the website under the technical report tab, and it's referenced in the Mana Whenua Section 32 report. That's also on the website.
Yeah, it's referenced in it, but do we need to receive it?
It's part of the materials.
Okay.
It's part of the Section 32 record.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
And there's a full copy of that report on the website.
All right. It's just I was reluctant to go looking at something that we hadn't been given, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, from my point of view, if it's as explained, it's part of the Section 32 record, it's part of the statutory process. You fill your boots, you can read it absolutely, so can anyone else in the world. Yeah.
And it's not our task to then take bits out of it and apply it to the plan. If we see things in there that we want some advice on, well, we will need to come back and ask for that.
Yes, they're not on the really big matters that we've been canvassing. So this one is not a small matter, but it's the wāhi tapu and the offer for Hokanui to come back potentially with some proposed additional wording. So this raised some questions for me, because wāhi tapu, they're not mentioned in Te Kawa or Te Taiao, but they are mentioned in Te Tangia Tauira and in the RMA itself. What I wondered was, do we really need to do this in the plan if, for instance, we could rely on reference to Te Tangia Tauira or RMA case law where applicable, or potentially Ms. Kane's evidence included a definition that sits inside the HNZPT Act. The reason I'm raising this is there's no shortage of ways to understand the term. Do we need to go this next step? Is it really necessary?
Yeah, so I think when I considered the wāhi tapu matter, that's why I had thought about, well, do we need a definition? And that's sort of where I had got the guidance from the National Planning Standards in terms of definition versus glossary. And so sort of taking guidance from the National Planning Standards, my sort of view is if it is something that we did need to include, then perhaps it would be best as an explanation in the Mana Whenua chapter rather than trying to further define it. So yeah, that's kind of where I'd landed, and I also had looked at the glossary in the draft plan, which also has an explanation of what wāhi tapu is. So yes, my thinking is it's more, I suppose I'm deferring to the panel to consider whether it is something that does need to be included, because from my view, I don't think it necessarily does.
Am I allowed to add some comments there?
They would be welcome.
Brilliant. So I definitely take the point that both of you are making, and I recognise that it is in the glossary. The reason that I've recommended having a description of the term in 2.3 is because I think it's important for us, for plan users, to make it really clear that there isn't a map with little dots on it that say these are where all the wāhi tapu are, and the way that some of the provisions now read with the inclusion of that term, which I support, it would imply to some people that there is this map of locations, and I would hate to put plan users in a position where they're looking for this map of wāhi tapu that they have to avoid developing on or near when that map doesn't exist. So if we were to add a description that makes it really clear that we're not talking about a discrete set of sites when we talk about Waihi Tapu in this context, we're talking about Waihi Tapu as more of a concept, then that would create some clarity in the plan and essentially stop a wild goose chase, really. That's why I've recommended that. So that's just another perspective to pop into the mix for the panel.
I need some more clarity. So on one hand, you're saying it doesn't actually exist. There's no plan. But we do need to include it as a concept. Does that mean that in a future date, there may well be areas or concerns of Waihi Tapu? What does it mean?
I can share my understanding, but I'll defer to Hokonui for the more authentic understanding. Waihi Tapu, generally, from my understanding as a planner, is locations that have certain levels of restrictions on them, and those types of restrictions range from something like you cannot eat here, but you can play rugby here, or you can go for a walk, but you can't eat food here, all the way through to you cannot build on this site, it must be left undisturbed. So there's a whole spectrum, and lots of areas, from my understanding, can be considered Waihi Tapu in that way, but at those different levels of intensity, for want of a better term. So when you're assessing different activities at site, particularly if you're using the Apiti Hono Tātai Hono methodology, you can understand, well, what are the intensities of that level of restriction, and are they actually relevant in this context or not? Because sometimes the area may be Waihi Tapu, but the activities that you're proposing to do on site don't infringe on any of that tapu, so actually it's not relevant in that discussion. But in sometimes it will be. So if you were to try and list every single location that has any level of tapu on it anywhere, that would be almost everywhere. But if you take it at more of that concept of Waihi Tapu, then you have that freedom to just take it into consideration where it's relevant in relation to the activity you're proposing, which actually creates a more permissive planning environment, which I think we're all trying to get towards in one way or another. But
Thank you.
Like
that's sufficient. That's sufficient for me.
Is there anything that you'd like to add there?
I guess just one small thing is, I suppose we've been quite intentional in saying it's Waihi Tapu rather than it's a Waihi Tapu site. So that's to hopefully avoid the confusion that it is restricted to a site and that it is more of a association with area rather than sort of trying to narrow it into that sort of site.
Keeping in mind that Waihi means site first, so but as you say site, you think
That led to a thought. I may as well share it now. All throughout today, we keep referring to sites and areas of significance, and most often, because sites is the first word in the SASM string, it's the one that gets all the attention. And in every exchange we've had today, it's been area. Here, it's about area. And maybe we could reflect that in the language in the plan. Just a thought. It's a question to come later. Actual questions based on your draft of evidence, circling back. Paragraph 60, Hokonui Runanga requesting amendments to GRUZ P6. When I read those amendments, it looks to me like an effects management hierarchy. So I'm wondering where we find support for the approach in higher order documents or potentially the iwi management plan.
So just to clarify, you're asking where you would find that guidance in higher level?
going up the chain, we obviously have to give effect to the RPS and instruments above all the way up to the Act. So I'm just wondering if there's direction that's guiding the use of such an approach in this context and where that might be.
I would have to come back to you on that, sorry, I don't know. So I can respond to that though.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Awesome.
Absolutely fine.
The words I highlighted in that policy were not possible. Throw enough money at anything, and there's a difference between the word possible and practical, and when it comes to policies, possible is, from my viewpoint, the best word to use.
We can, as Ms. Buren said, report back on that. I don't have it in front of me. Probably the most relevant national policy statement for this context would be the MPSIB. But I'm sure Ms. Behrens can check that. I just don't have it in front of me about the language it uses as you cascade down the effects management hierarchy. But we can check that.
So at your paragraph 65, and you are addressing GRUZ P13, when I read the criteria in 1, 2 and 3, if you imagine a full stop after Wāhi Tapu, everything in 1, 2 or 3 above that would appear to be a presence-absence sort of criteria. You're either in an ONL, or an SNA, or in an area of unacceptable natural hazard risk, or you're in a Wāhi Tapu.
Sorry, can I just catch up? You said paragraph 165, is that
65, but actually I'm talking at 63, like her analysis is 65, but the provision is 63.
and you referred to some words, Wāhi Tapu, I was just trying to find it.
So Wāhi Tapu is mentioned in that subclause 3. And so what I was saying is, if you imagine a full stop at Wāhi Tapu and everything above that in 1, 2 and 3 would appear to be a sort of quite a simple presence or absence. Now I may be misinterpreting that given the last conversation that we had. But I was noting that in order to apply that second part of 3, there's an effects assessment required, because you've got that significance test that we were talking about at the start of the day. And so they seem to be different things. So I was wondering if they belong together. So that's my question. Do they belong together? Given that we've got presence or absence, you're either in, you're out, whereas over here you'd have to do an effects assessment for significance to determine whether you're in or you're out.
Yeah, so they are two different things.
So it'd be number 4.
It can be number 4. I think, yeah, they are two separate things that we're looking at there. So if it helps to clarify that provision by having it separated out, I don't see an issue with that.
Very lastly, there were some items that I deferred from hearing stream 1 that were to be picked up for a conversation with Hokonui in this hearing. I'm hoping they're not too complicated and we can rattle through them relatively quickly. in the overview part of the plan at the front, statutory acknowledgements are specifically mentioned in relation to the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act 1998. And I wanted to know that we weren't missing, it was part of my reason for asking Ms Brand around matters of cultural redress in the Settlement Act, and is the statutory acknowledgement the only thing that we should be referencing in relation to the NTCSA?
So I do cover that off. I'll just quickly go back to, I think it's, so if you go to paragraph 16 of my evidence where I cover off the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement Act. And so I think the things that I've mentioned in paragraph 17 is the Matoda River, which is recognised as a statutory acknowledgement, but also the Matoda River Mataito Reserve, but in terms of the actual settlement itself, it's the statutory acknowledgement.
Okay. In the consultation and engagement portion of the plan, it refers to iwi management plan without specifically mentioning Te Tangi a Tauira. Should we be routinely specific about Te Tangi a Tauira being the relevant iwi management plan for this district?
So just to make sure I understand, you are asking whether it should be more explicitly included in the plan or referenced in the plan?
At the point where it's referencing consultation and engagement, so this is relevant to some of the discussions we've had today, where we don't have a fulsome Āpiti Honol Tātai Honol, for instance, we've got evidence in front of us that we really do need to lean into the relevant iwi management plan, which is Te Tangi a Tauira. So rather than making a bland reference to iwi management plan, should we be very directive around where we want people to be looking?
I would say yes. It's a mandated iwi management plan, so that in the absence of having that further information that's yet to come through this Āpiti Honol Tātai Honol approach, that's where we would hope plan users would be going to.
Just to add that section 4 of that chapter is specifically dedicated to Te Tangi a Tauira.
Yeah, so it's inconsistent in terms of in the overview whether it blandly references iwi management plan or whether it directly points to Te Tangi. So yes, you're right, that section's there. This was, yeah, anyway, just want to know that we are consistent. And then there are definitions that I'm interested in, and I'm just not clear where they're going to come through in the hearing, so feel free to bump me to another hearing if you want to. One of the definitions is cultural markers, and at the moment I think it refers to Māori generally, and I wanted to know that whether we should be specifically referring to Ngāi Tahu in relation to cultural markers.
We don't have a submission on that provision.
No, so this is in the realm of potentially a clause 16. So it's probably a broader question where the plan refers to Māori generally. Do we have to be careful around where we want to be specific around Ngāi Tahu? That's probably the broader question to ask and have answered. And we can apply that through clause 16 where we see fit.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the definition now. So I'll just quickly read through it. So po whenua, carved posts, interpretation panels, Māori art installations and other kaupapa Māori markers of place or relationship of mana whenua to place. So whether that Māori should be more specific, that's what you're wondering?
Yeah. Or is it okay just because of the final reference to mana whenua?
Well, Ms. Beeren's thinking I might just give my sort of legal interpretation, and you've touched on it at the end there, Commissioner, which is I'd imply Ngāi Tahu into that because of the mana whenua reference, and that the mana whenua definition, although somewhat clunky, and I think we spoke about that at the first hearing, does reference Ngāi Tahu.
Three more. The definition of sensitive environments. This might be something that comes up in multiple hearings, so this is more like a flag. Are some environments missing from the definition of sensitive environments when thinking about these historic heritage and areas of significance to Māori matters that we've been canvassing?
We'll make a note of that one. It'll, my gut feel is potentially yes. It would depend where that definition's, the context it's used in, but appreciate the signal. We'll look into that one. Did you have anything, Amy, to add to that?
Not for sensitive environments, I'll have to come back to that one. I guess just going back a step, and I will come back and I think I appreciate having that chance to go away and have a bit more of a think around whether it's more appropriate to have Ngāi Tahu there rather than a more generic Māori. I guess I'm just sort of keeping in the back of my mind when it does come to the multi-purpose zone and having read the Section 32 report, there was discussion around providing for mana whenua as well as tangata whenua, so I guess I'm just kind of keeping that in mind too. But I can come back to that too.
That's actually helpful, just having that exchange. Two more. The taonga species definition, I really struggled with the sentence in that definition. Where might we look to improve upon it?
I was just posing to Amy whether that, because it does reference the Settlement Act, but I'd want to check whether there was actually a defined term in the Settlement Act potentially for taonga species, but I'd have to check that.
And I'm mostly just thinking about usability and how we can address that, what tools we've got available to us. And And this last one really is a flag as we go through. We don't have a definition of Māori land in the plan, although the term is used. And so as we're going through the plan and hitting different provisions, we're going to have to understand or be sure that we're all clear on what we're relying on there. And that was my last point.
Just clarify, because a lot of those issues I raised in my right of reply for hearing stream 1, and so the questions about where is sensitive environments referred to, that's in my right of reply for hearing stream 1. So if you're trying to understand where those provisions are articulated throughout the plan, that's a useful starting point.
Kia ora for that. I appreciate it. I know some of this was covered in yours. It was just thinking there might be some valuable assistance to come through from Hokanui on those. Kia ora.
Okay, has anybody got anything to add? Come on.
I think we've used up our time slot. Chair.
Thank you all for your input. It's appreciated, and representatives of Renyanga and Courtney, of course, and legal representation. I'll now adjourn the panel and the hearing till tomorrow morning. We'll be discussing other matters, so thank you very much.
Can I just raise an issue? It's about Courtney's potential availability, because we've got the hearing timetable changed, and we've got Federated Farmers coming in, I think, now tomorrow afternoon sometime. And so we just need to make sure, because there's content in there, evidence relating to the Mana Whenua chapter, so is your expectation that Courtney would be available for that?
Either in person or online.
What time? I can be back at 3.
And also thank you, Linda Murchison, for your interest. And so, yes, we're adjourned. Thank you.